Many aspects of Final Fantasy VIII have left lingering questions in the mind of the player that remain debated to this day, among which is the fleeting but pertinent line uttered by Seifer in the first few hours of the game, which is his promise to tell us about his romantic dream. Now, this was much discussed at the time of the game's release, and continues to be until this day, partly because Seifer never actually tells us what his romantic dream is, but also due to the conflicted ideas and interpretations about what he even means by that. So here we are going to look back at why players cling on to this phrase so much, why is it so speculated upon, and how, after all, does it inform our perception of Seifer and his arc over the course of the game. Jumping right in, I think irrespective of how we interpret its meaning, this statement by Seifer, uttered so early in the game, was a fantastic hook that prompted intrigue into his character, and indeed the entire Dolit mission served in many ways to establish Seifer's character, as much as it did the macro-political events and the story of Galbadia. So really looking at this line, one of these days I'll tell you about my romantic dream, one of the first conversation points among players has often been what does he mean by the word romantic, with some interpreting it as romantic love, others as a rose-tinted idealistic use of the word romantic. And personally, I've always been in the latter camp, although I do think it's an interesting choice of word that sits across both the English and the Japanese versions of the game, and alludes to, I think, the undercurrent of longing that affects both the characters of Squall and Seifer, which each of them manifests in radically different ways. Additionally, bearing in mind that prior to the events of the game, Seifer has had some sort of blossoming romance or interaction with Rinoa, some of the arguments for his romantic dream statement have come from players who assume that he may be referring to Rinoa with this statement, or perhaps fantasizing himself as her knight. But looking to the fact that she does later become a sorceress, and Seifer of course aspires to be a sorceress's knight, I quite enjoy that interpretation to the extent to which Seifer's fantasies become something more of a reality. But turning to the generally more accepted view of the statement, many view Seifer's romantic dream as this rose-tinted fantasy of himself as a sorceress's knight, embodying the virtues of a strong protector, a leading man, and so on. And while he doesn't outrightly tell us this, it is played out by actions, and his entire arc following the Dolit mission is Ultimecia in the guise of Edea playing into this boyhood fantasy, manipulating him into subservience by telling him to leave his childhood behind, when ironically she's actually trapping him in it, and subsequent run-ins with Seifer show that he literally describes himself as a sorceress's knight prior to our boss fights with him. Obviously believes himself to be a benevolent, loyal knight. He believes he's on the right side of history there, and is unable to look beyond the fantasy that he's trapped himself in. So, delving a little deeper on this, Seifer's fascinating in how a lot of his story arc is a subtle undercurrent in the game, rather than overtly shown or explained to us. And it also adds layers, as we'll see, to how we might perceive other characters. And you need to join the dots a bit here. And I've discussed him a few times on the channel over the years, and touched on his character arc, because it still gets discussed and debated to this day, and I think it's a really interesting hook of Final Fantasy VIII's story. But firstly, we have Seifer's intentions. Where does this dream to be a sorceress's knight come from, and why does it make him tick? So on the first point, this is actually shown to us in the game in a remarkably subtle way, with the seemingly random and inconsequential fourth Laguna dream. And it's here we see Laguna shooting a movie in the role of a sorceress's knight, fending off a ruby dragon, and the first clue is that he's of course playing a sorceress's knight, which is of course the role that Seifer is obsessed with in the present day. And the second clue is that he has the identical one-handed gunblade stance as Seifer, and that's it. It takes the player's attentiveness, and in my case several years, to realise this connection, because no overt further mention to it is made. But basically Laguna's movie serves as Seifer's inspiration, and the Ultimania goes a bit further on this, stating that the movie is based on historical events and a real-life sorceress's knight named Zefer, which Seifer actually mentions in a spin-off game, which is the now defunct Opera Omnia mobile game. Now, digging a little deeper, Seifer's dream to be a knight is arguably symptomatic of and correlates with other characters in the game and those that grew up as orphans. Each one of these characters, including Irvine, Zell, Selphie, Quistis, and of course Squall, have some sort of coping mechanism and false persona that they've built for themselves, and it contrasts and covers up their deepest insecurities, which we could argue stems from them being orphans and having abandonment issues. For example, Irvine presents himself as a cool, confident ladies' man, but then cracks under pressure. Zell presents himself as a brazen upstart fighter, but is a chicken wuss who follows the rules. And Quistis is this pseudo big sister instructor type, whose facade quickly unravels when she's stripped of her instructor's license. And then we have Squall, who's got the emotional yearning for connection, particularly with Big Sis, but he has walled himself up and created this false persona of stoic, emotionless silence. So while Seifer has often been mocked by players and indeed characters in the game for receding into this world of fantasy with this romantic dream of his, looked at in a certain way, he's opted to cope with childhood trauma by reimagining himself and representing himself to the world in a way that's not entirely dissimilar from what the other characters in the game are doing. In keeping with Seifer and the other characters, the party characters, another layer of intrigue comes from the fact that sorceress Edea is of course Matron, who was their childhood carer at the orphanage. And another reading of Seifer's romantic dream is that if not Renoa, then does he perhaps imagine himself as the loyal protector of the only other significant woman in his life, which is the maternal figure of Matron. So again, not discussed in the game events per se, but there is perhaps some substance to this, because there's an assumption that Seifer remembers the past and the orphan's childhood where the others don't. For example, he doesn't wield guardian forces and so isn't afflicted by amnesia. He calls Zell chicken wuss, which is evidenced both in the past and in the present, and he outright states to Squall, "Why do you want to fight Matron after everything she's done for us?" So we might assume he's known all along, making Ultimecia appearing in the guise of Edea the perfect projection for him to live out his fantasy. As an aside, many have questioned why, if Seifer knew all along about the party's history together, why didn't he just say something? Which on the one hand, I get, but on the other hand, really, what does he have to say to them? He doesn't get along with them. The fact that they don't talk about the past either, because they've forgotten it, may even agitate and isolate him even more. And regardless, how many of us really discuss our mutual childhood with our friends? You know, maybe some people do, but I've got friends that I've known since I was 5, 6, 7 years old, literally never talk about that stuff with them. They are just part of the furniture of my life in a good way. So maybe if Squall and co wholesale forgot who Seifer was and asked him who the hell he was, then he'd have to explain some things to them. But evidently there is some residual knowledge and connection to one another, and so while Seifer's potential memories may be considered a plot hole by some, I think there's definite plausibility there, and I think there is case to suggest that Seifer remembers things that others don't. So we've established Seifer's romantic dream as a driving aspect of his arc through the game, and I think the final bits to touch on is how this wraps up, how this concludes, but also how it relates to Squall. Now, one thing I've always loved about Seifer is this rivalry he has with Squall, and how these two are the complete opposites of one another, and yet in so many ways the same. For example, if we assume Seifer has this maternal longing for Matron, Squall in many ways correlates with this in his longing for Big Sis, which is a direct cause for the personas that they create for themselves. Seifer being the knight that protects the sorceress, and Squall cocooning himself away, pretending he doesn't have emotions after the loss of a loan. Indeed, the similarities manifest in other ways, such as the desire to prove themselves, which is glimpsed in the brief moment of camaraderie during the Dollet mission, where they want to wreak some havoc. Of course, the opening FMV, where they are battling pretty hard in their training exercise. The fact that they are both incapable of opening up to others, and are fiercely independent. We have the fact that they both wield a gunblade, which some have argued was Squall's desire to compete with Seifer manifesting yet again by choosing the same weapon as Seifer's boyhood dream. And finally, we have more abstract subtleties, such as how their lives are simultaneously, yet inadvertently, profoundly affected by Laguna, with Seifer and Laguna's presence in the movie that he's driven by, and Squall by, of course, the absence of Laguna as father. So there's a lot of overlap between Squall and Seifer that neither would readily admit. The fact that Squall later says that he would become a sorceress's knight to defend Rinoa shows, in fact, that he is capable of the same sort of fantasizing to justify potentially bad acts. And yet, the key distinction between them, I think, and their character arcs, is ultimately that Squall is eventually able to relinquish his facade in how he opens up to his friends, and specifically Rinoa, while Seifer pursues this dream to the very end, even once the romantic dream turns into something more of a nightmare. Indeed, he is incapable of extracting himself from the fantasy until it's far too late, and he's gone down this road to ruin. We see him increasingly battered and bruised, committing increasingly heinous acts that can't be reconciled with the ideas of a benevolent knight. And this, I think, is what makes Seifer so interesting. It's the flawed humanity of his character, who I often compare to characters like Boromir from Lord of the Rings. Boromir, for example, his intent is to use the ring to do good, but because he has this flawed human temperament, it makes him so susceptible to its evil. Seifer, likewise, is blinded by his dream to protect a sorceress, and he doesn't acknowledge or realise the obvious evil of Ultimecia, and nor did he ever really stand a chance, since Ultimecia consistently proves that she is able to dive into the psyche and draw out the insecurities of our characters. Firstly, of course, with Seifer, and then in the final boss battle with Squall, where she conjures Griever from his subconscious. So, Seifer's romantic dream, the statement that he utters so early in the game, is arguably the single most important thing he says. It is a statement loaded with meaning about his past, his intentions and his ambitions, and it's what propels every action he does over the course of the game. Coming to the conclusion, this is another interesting aspect of Seifer's story that has often been misread by audiences. Some have viewed it as his banishment from Garden and a sort of purgatorial fate as he sees it flying overhead. Others, perhaps rightly, have viewed it as inconsequential or confused, owing to the cut content of the game that focused on Seifer, and I discussed that in a recent episode. But for me, those readings are perhaps failing to see the forest through the trees. I think this is a calm moment, the simplicity of fishing among friends, laughing with Raijin and Fujin, is Seifer, for quite possibly the first time ever, living in the moment and enjoying his reality rather than some idealised fiction that he's crafted for himself. It is perhaps the beginning of a redemption arc that we never get to see, and a Seifer that is finally unshackled from his boyhood coping mechanism of a romantic dream.